Honorable Minister Padoan, dear Ambassador Benassi, dear Consul Canfora, dear Mr. President Weidmann, dear Professor Issing, distinguished colleagues and guests, in my capacity as Vice President for Internationalization of this marvelous university, and being a principal investigator of SAFE and member of the House of Finance myself, I'm particularly delighted to welcome you here at Goethe-University's still growing campus West End for today's lecture of one of the currently most pressing issues of growth, solidarity, political and policy questions in these difficult times. Goethe-University is greatly honored to host this lecture, and I would like to take this opportunity to express our sincere thanks to the organizers and sponsors, SAFE, the CFS, and of course, the Deutsche Bundesbank. Ladies and gentlemen, for quite a few of you, it will be the first visit to our university, therefore please allow me to briefly provide you with some general information. With currently almost 47,000 students, Goethe-University is one of the largest universities in Germany and the state of Hessen, and one of the 10 largest research-oriented universities in Germany. Over its almost 100 years of history, our university has developed strong profiles in both the social and the natural sciences. To highlight some particular strongholds of Goethe University, we are known for our 3 clusters of excellence in the areas of medicine, macromolecular research, and social science. One of the latest additions is the Research Center Sustainable Architecture for Finance in Europe, SAFE, located at the House of Finance. It analyzes the requirements for an optimal framework for financial markets and their agents. SAFE aims to become the leading research center in Europe on all areas relevant for developing a sustainable architecture for finance that offers a dynamic interaction with policymakers and society while engaging a critical mass of young researchers and professionals in SAFE activities, thus covering all important 3 areas, 3 activities that an institution should cover: research, policy, and education and training. Another key characteristic of Goethe University is that we have been building over the last 10 years now. With the generous handing over of attractive new building estates by public authorities in the 1990s, the university got the possibility to develop 2 entirely new campuses, one of them being the campus West End, where we are now in the center of Frankfurt for the humanities and social sciences, the second one at the campus Riedberg in the north of the city for the natural sciences, the so-called Science City. The Pelzig building at the entrance to this campus was finished in 1932 as the headquarters of the largest chemical enterprise of its time, the IG Farben industry, which was known for the forced labor it employed and the war production throughout the Second World War it was involved in. After the war, the Allied forces occupied this ground, and General Eisenhower's office was located in this building and the stage for important historic events. This was also where, on June 20th, in 1948, the new West German currency was proclaimed. Professor Issing is nodding his head. And the building program is but one element of a larger encompassing process of change that Goethe University started at the beginning of the century in its strive for overall excellence. We've also undergone a fundamental inner change as we are no longer a state-run institution of higher education. Since 2008, Goethe University has become a foundation under public law. This goes back to Goethe's original status as a foundation university. Our institution had originally been founded in 1914 by wealthy citizens of the city of Frankfurt and was the first university in Germany to be funded exclusively on the basis of donation. Today, its new legal status makes Goethe University one of the few German universities enjoying a considerable degree of institutional autonomy, and this change in status largely increases our capacity to raise funds and to attract the faculty we need to become an internationally top-ranking university. In short, this is the software we need to successfully achieve our goals, which include, first and foremost, such rewarding opportunities and moments of intellectually productive encounters like today's lecture, making Goethe University a special place and a widely visible lighthouse, not only of teaching and research, but also of lively public debate. I very much hope that we will also be able to enter into such an inspiring and fruitful discussion today. Thank you.
Dear Professor Ha, thank you very much for that kind introduction, but especially dear Pier Carlo, Ambassador, dear Ottmar Issing, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome you here today at the University of Frankfurt. And as you all perfectly know and have been reminded just a minute ago, this university is named after the famous German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Goethe was born in Frankfurt in 1749, and after finishing his studies in Leipzig and Strasbourg, he returned to Frankfurt and worked as a lawyer before moving to Weimar, where he spent most of his life. In 1786, Goethe left Weimar to set out on a 2-year journey to Italy. The journey was an escape of sorts. His work at the court in Weimar had blocked his literary creativity, and Goethe hoped that Italy's classic culture and antique treasures would reawaken his artistic talents. On exactly this night, 230 years ago, Goethe was in the Apennine Mountains, close to Bologna, on his way to Rome. It was one of his childhood dreams to see the Eternal City, and when he walked through the Porta del Popolo on November 1st, 1786, he wrote in his diary, "Finally, I've arrived in this capital of the world." Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker today probably knows how Goethe felt, because he himself is a true Roman, and he has spent much of his life in the Italian capital. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you, Pier Carlo, Minister of Economy and Finance of Italy. Pier Carlo, you may not have traveled from Rome to Germany for quite the same reasons that Goethe did in the past, but I'm sure that it will also be inspiring, certainly for the audience, but maybe also for you too. As I've already mentioned, Pier Carlo was born in Rome, but spent some of his youth in Canada, and after returning to his hometown, he studied economics at Università La Sapienza, which is the biggest university in Italy, as you might know. After graduating in 1973, he filled an impressive range of posts in the academic world. He was professor of international economic relations at the University of Urbino before moving to his alma mater, where he has been teaching economics since 1991. From 1992 to 2001, he also held a position at the College of Brussels, Europe in Bruges, and in addition, he served as a visiting professor in Brussels, Buenos Aires, Tokyo, and Warsaw. But Pier Carlo did not confine himself to academia. His expertise in economics was also highly sought after in the world of politics when he was economic advisor to the Italian Prime Ministers D'Alema and Amato from 1998 to 2001. From 2001 to 2005, he worked at the IMF as the Italian executive director, and after being put forward as a candidate by the Italian government, Pier Carlo was appointed Deputy Secretary General of the OECD in 2007 to become chief economist only 2 years later. In 2014, then, he was due to take the reins at Italy's National Statistics Agency, but new Prime Minister Matteo Renzi had apparently other plans for him. On February 22nd of 2014, Renzi named him Minister of Economy and Finance of Italy. And this marks an important similarity between you, Pier Carlo, and Goethe. Today, Goethe is of course best known as a writer and a poet, but in fact, he spent a large part of his career as a public servant at the court of the Duke of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach. At court, he was mainly responsible for consolidating the high levels of public debt, which he successfully reduced by cutting military expenditure and simplifying the tax system. Goethe's financial expertise prompted the Duke to name him Kammerpräsident in 1782, which is the equivalent of Minister of Finance at the time. To avoid any misunderstanding, I would argue that the similarities end here, because as a writer, Goethe also described far more radical and I would say tempting ideas for reducing the burden of highly indebted sovereigns. In Faust II, Mephisto advises the emperor to simply issue paper money, which in Goethe's piece ended in economic disaster. Ladies and gentlemen, as his impressive biography shows, our speaker today doesn't need historical or literary advice when it comes to economic policy. Even before his time at the OECD, but especially, I would argue, during this time, Pier Carlo was concerned with seeking solutions to promote economic growth and create employment. And whenever he shares his rich knowledge of the working of structural reforms, for instance, at the G20 or G7 meetings, colleagues are listening very attentively. Since his inauguration as Minister of Finance and Economics in 2014, the Italian government has implemented very important structural reforms, and I'm quite sure that Pier Carlo was among those who influenced the development of these reforms. They include, inter alia, the labor market reform, which is intended, among other things, to ease access to the job market for the unemployed, and they include also reforms to streamline the public administration. A further crucial step will certainly be taken on December 4th, when the Italian people will vote in a referendum on the reform of the Senate, which could be a catalyst for further reforms. Today, Pier Carlo will talk about promoting growth, employment, and solidarity in Europe in times of political and policy uncertainty. A German speaker would probably have said promoting growth, employment, and solidity, but you will show us how we reconcile the two. I assume that his speech will address the economic situation and the need for further reforms in some of the euro area countries, but it may also well include an additional dimension, which is the role of common decision-making and burden sharing in the euro area. Striking a balance between these two aspects is essential to the European Monetary Union, and the future economic development of the euro area. We are therefore most interested to hear your thoughts on how we can promote growth and how solidarity in Europe will strengthen the monetary union without undermining the incentives for sound national policies. For me as a central banker, of course, stability or solidity is of particular concern, and sound fiscal policies are an important precondition for a stability-oriented monetary policy. Against this background, the stringent implementation and interpretation of our fiscal rules are essential for building confidence in that sustainability. And for me, the large countries, especially Germany, France, and Italy, must live up to their particular responsibilities. Dear Pier Carlo, when Goethe returned to Weimar from Rome in 1788, the outstanding impressions of his journey had such a profound effect that he grew weary of the day-to-day struggle related to economic politics. As a consequence, he decided to focus on his passion, namely writing and fine arts, and gave up politics. I'm fairly certain that your short trip to Frankfurt, which is rather quite rainy and not as nice as Rome in these days, will not trigger the same feeling on your return. And I also feel that your passion is indeed economics. But now it's time for your talk. Pier Carlo, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here today.
Professor Haar, Professor Issing, ladies and gentlemen, but especially Jens, President Weidmann, thank you very much for this invitation to this prestigious university. As Jens Weidmann reminded us just a minute ago, I spent most of my time at the university and I really enjoyed it a lot. And I'm looking forward to going back there, who knows when. I'm also humbled and really flattered for the undeserving and undeserved words that align my career to that of a great man such as Wolfgang Goethe. Indeed, I did not know about his experience as finance minister, and I should perhaps go back and look at what he has done. Maybe I can get some good economic advice in addition to cultural advice. The title of my talk is Promoting Growth, Employment and Solidarity in Europe After the British Referendum. Let me assure you that by no means I did not want to mention or think about solidity and sustainability. Let's agree on the words, but the concept is the same. So let me, just to give you the flavor, let me give you the key points of my speech. First of all, I will start from the fact that we are now in a world of increased policy uncertainty. And against the backdrop of a heightened uncertainty, we need a coordinated strategy in Europe to preserve the sustainability of the European project. The outcome of the British referendum has further certified how much the European Union is struggling. To underpin the EU project, it is crucial to rebuild trust and confidence, regaining growth and creating good quality employment. To this effect, we have to use both our common and our national toolboxes to boost public and private investment, implement a more balanced fiscal stance, achieve an effective interaction between structural reforms and EU-reinforced action. We also have to reinforce our common tools and institutions to manage what I would like to call European public goods and face new challenges such as migration. But let me start from political uncertainty. Despite the collective effort at the EU and global level towards strong, sustainable and balanced growth, economic prospects remain weak and unequally distributed, with significant downside risks. The latest updates to the outlook delivered by the international organizations have once more reviewed growth projections downward. After the deep recession in 2008 and 2009, we would have expected an acceleration of growth, putting the world economy quickly back to peak levels of GDP and inflation. This did not happen. Certainly, it did not happen in Europe, leaving the recovery significantly below expectations that were modeled on past experience. So we are in a new scenario. In a nutshell, such a scenario could be described as the result of rising preference for savings, accompanied by decreasing propensity to invest. This combination hampers growth, reduces real interest rates, and compresses inflation. In such a context, markets expect that interest and inflation rates, as well as growth, will stay low for long. And markets have embedded in their expectations what we now should call or could call a new normal. While high savings can be justified by higher risk aversion, low investment can be explained, and has been explained by many analyses, including by international organizations, at the same time by weak demand and high policy uncertainty. And I would like to concentrate on this second element. Heightened policy uncertainty should not be related specifically to election results. After all, we have been having elections for a long time, and this is not necessarily associated with policy uncertainty. What is the new element in the scenario is that now, more than in the past, policy outcomes, election outcomes, or referendum outcomes could lead to policy results that are seen as able to trigger systemic impacts. And indeed, this has been the case of the British referendum. This implies that as election or referendum approach, there is a wait-and-see attitude by households and business that is prevailing. This holds back investment and consumption decisions while it increases precautionary savings. In addition, in an environment of uncertainty, frequent and significant shocks to aggregate demand, if not properly addressed, can produce persistent damages to the economy to the so-called hysteresis effects. After a negative shock or recurring bad news, firms can choose to postpone their investment plans, for instance in research and innovation, cut the turnover, and eventually shut down factories and productive sites. If prolonged, a recession implies an increase of long-term unemployed who tend to lose their skills and separate from the labor market, deteriorating the match between demand and supply and increasing segmentation. At the aggregate level, these effects can have long-lasting impacts on the future productive capacity of the economy. Potential output will go down and stay down. In addition, for workers, being out of work depresses confidence and exacerbates exclusion and inequality. In such a context, to dissipate uncertainty, policy action is more crucial than ever. Policy action must support demand and supply factors in a coherent long-term framework in order to amplify the benefits of structural reform and investment. All available policy tools must be activated in a coordinated fashion, as the now accepted, broadly accepted policy paradigm, including at the G20, reminds us. So monetary policy must be accommodative. Fiscal policy should be supportive where fiscal space is available, while structural reforms should clear the path to higher growth rates from administrative and regulatory hurdles by liberalizing labor and product markets, making the system more flexible and more reactive to policy stimuli. Along these lines, an effective growth strategy should include reforms aimed at making the institutional framework more predictable and stable, so that policy decisions can be introduced quickly and reinforce long-term expectations and propensity to invest. Evidence shows how significant the negative impact of institutional instability can be on growth. This stems from the uncertainty it generates for consumers and investors, from the lack of policy directions which make an economy more vulnerable to shocks, and from a more conflictual relationship between different levels of government, local and national. Policy uncertainty and low growth prospects are prominent in the European landscape today. The EU is particularly exposed to the risks of prolonged weak growth compared to other regions. As in Europe, population is aging more quickly, innovation is less dynamic, and the financial system is more fragmented, weakening further the transmission mechanism of monetary stimulus. In such a perspective, it is not surprising if, after 8 years of recession, financial crisis and stagnation, the European project is suffering a credibility crisis. This crisis is compounded by the diffuse perception that the policy reaction to the economic downturn and the sizable unemployment is insufficient. EU citizens fail to perceive the value added of being part of the Union and look for different alternatives. A consequence of such a credibility crisis is that national interests tend to prevail over collective ones. Growing signs of dissatisfaction, fed by the exceptional duration and intensity of the crisis, are boosting consensus for populist proposals. Euroscepticism is on the rise in many member states, thus enhancing the impact of policy uncertainty. I believe instead that the European Union is a historic opportunity. We must seize such an opportunity and deliver to our citizens what they expect: less inequality, more jobs, more security. We have gone a long way in our own integration process, including since the breakout of the financial crisis. But now Europe is at a crossroad. If we were to keep muddling through an uncertain recovery, progress in growth and jobs creation would fail to emerge, and both the EU and the euro area would remain exposed to shocks, undermining their sustainability. Importantly, as support for the EU project falters, mutual trust also weakens, making it more difficult to reinforce common institutions. If Europe is to be part of the solution and not part of the problem, we must rebuild trust among our citizens, member states, and European and national institutions, and develop an EU-wide strategy to restore sustained growth, boost jobs, and fight inequality. A virtuous interaction between national policies and EU-coordinated action is the master strategy for the European Union to catch up with higher growth, jobs, and less inequality. Let me offer just a few examples of the strategy, how the strategy should unfold. Of course, this is a very complex task, and as I said, I will just offer a few thoughts about a very complicated issue. As I've already mentioned, against the backdrop of slow and fragile recovery, boosting investment, both public and private, is the top priority to put back the European Union on a path of sustainable growth. Investment supports demand in the short term and strengthens supply and potential output in the medium term. Over the recent past, the fall in investment in the European countries has been widespread. We have to use all our policy measures available at the national and EU level to accelerate a reversal. The Juncker Plan and the European Fund for Strategic Investment were launched by the new Commission with the goal of deploying public leverage to reach out to potentially profitable investment plans whose risk the private sector would not bear on its own. This strategy must be extended and implemented more forcefully, also by targeting the creation of knowledge-based capital, innovation, and infrastructure. We should boost a financing and investment union, where the completion of the banking union, the capital market union, and the Juncker investment plan contribute to a more effective transfer of savings towards investment, including infrastructure investment. The EU governance framework should provide for more incentives for investment in European public goods, including migration and possibly defense, also at the national level. Further common European initiatives should be explored. Projects to enhance EU growth potential could be financed by joint debt issuance. At the national level, to expand investment and support growth, member countries should use the composition of their budget within their fiscal space to target public resources to support investment and competitiveness. In this respect, the newly established European Fiscal Board could take a pan-European view and formulate fiscal policy recommendations for the euro area as a whole. This is key to develop an aggregate policy stance and the EU-wide growth strategy which goes beyond the mere addition of national performance. Symmetry is needed in macroeconomic adjustment. There is room for improvement in the surveillance of macroeconomic policy and structural reforms. Instilling more balance in the way macro surveillance refers to deficit and surplus countries is a key starting point to improve efficiency of the EU surveillance mechanism. Structural reforms in all member states are as relevant as fiscal discipline to build up European Union's economic resilience to external and endogenous shocks and to boost economic convergence. Structural reforms unveil new profit and investment opportunities. The key point is their full implementation. In this respect, the following issues come to mind. First, consensus matters. When designing a plan for structural reform, it is of utmost importance that potential winners and losers are identified beforehand so that measures can be included in the strategy to preserve inclusiveness. Second, structural reforms take time to deploy their effects. In Europe, we know this very well. Germany, for example, has proved to be more resilient than other countries during the financial crisis, also thanks to labor market reforms implemented way back, a few years back. Third, focusing the reform effort only in one area, even an high priority one, might not be sufficient. Some reforms are more groundbreaking than others. However, experience shows that reforms benefits accumulate if a package of reforms is introduced in a coordinated way. To the same extent, benefits of structural reform in any one country would be magnified if other countries also introduce reforms. This calls for coordinated action at national and EU-wide reforms at all levels. But we also have structural reforms at the EU level, and this implies bringing in the single market dimension. In all the measures, the single market remains one of the main drivers of growth, and I am sad to note that the single market non-completed agenda is still large. I have mentioned the finalization of the Capital Markets Union. I would add the creation of a proper energy union and the establishment of an innovation union, a strategy to pool research and knowledge capital, improve spillovers and diffusion of innovation, and deliver a more inclusive economic system. Which brings me to inclusion and inequality, a new dimension in the policy discourse which must gain prominence. Evidence shows that a more inclusive economic system is one with better growth and employment perspectives. Over the last decades, inequality has been increasing in most advanced economies, notwithstanding the belief that higher growth would have been beneficial to all by simply a percolation of the benefits of growth through all segments of society. In fact, the access to economic opportunities is now significantly different at the two extremes of the social ladder, and this produces a loss in terms of productivity and growth prospects, as well, of course, as well-being. On the contrary, evidence shows that a higher inclusion could reinforce growth. So there is a case for measures to support inclusion in the European Union and in the euro area. Again, here measures can be thought in a broad range. Let me, however, spend a few words about a proposal which the Italian government has put forward about adding an explicit employment dimension in the Eurozone, a European scheme against cyclical unemployment. Such a mechanism would enhance citizens' trust in the European Union and in the Eurozone as well, serving as a positive signal of the effectiveness of monetary union by building an important link between monetary and financial convergence and the labor market. Dealing with structural unemployment, of course, requires structural measures, but especially in a monetary union, in the absence of the exchange rate, it is of paramount importance to address the impact of adjustment on employment and wage dynamics. while diminishing the impact of severe shocks on budget balance. In addition, such a scheme would reduce the probability that a cyclical downturn would produce a long-lasting impact on growth potential, smoothing the fluctuations of the economic cycle and generating positive spillovers across the area. The introduction of this system would not imply any treaty change. The instrument would be triggered by severe unemployment shocks, providing a stabilization function. It would build on an appropriate incentive structure in order to limit moral hazard and avoid permanent transfers from some countries to others. No net losers and net winners in the long run. Finally, one key element of the heightened policy uncertainty is the emergence of new challenges. As the 5 Presidents' report has acknowledged, the European countries face common challenges, interests, and responsibilities. This common destiny requires commonly agreed rules and the implementation of common strategies. Migration represents the most urgent issue that Europe has to face today. To help address it, a few months ago, Italy offered the suggestion to implement a European approach to a migration compact. Europe needs to act by deploying an integrated and sustainable initiative addressing both the consequences and the causes of mass migration. The June European Council has taken on board key elements of the Migration Compact by launching the new partnership framework with countries of origin and transit of migration flows. We need now to make the framework operational and effective. Let me just mention a few points that, in my view, are absolutely necessary for the response to the migration issue to be effective. First, integration. Benefits of integrating migrants in national labor markets far outweigh the short-term cost, particularly in an aging society. Properly designed and effective integration policies are of the utmost importance to reap such benefits while coping with the costs. Second, investment in the origin countries to generate decent living conditions and perspectives in addition to security, and therefore jobs and growth in these countries. The external deployment of the Juncker plan should provide a backbone of such a pillar. Third, borders. An effective migration strategy requires a common management of borders, a truly European public good. Such a strategy would send a strong signal for integration. A common management of borders would strengthen confidence and avoid even the suspect of opportunistic behavior. Ladies and gentlemen, the Brexit vote has increased policy uncertainty, especially over the medium term. Strategic decisions are being considered by market participants in the expectation that the redefinition of the UK-EU relationship will impact on costs and benefits of long-term investment and relocation. In continental Europe, a sequence of election and referendum events could, in some cases, lead to outcomes that would question basic choices about the EU and Euro area membership. The alternative, to remain in Europe, is not by itself sufficient to reduce policy uncertainty by a significant amount. The real alternative requires accelerating the process of integration so as to deliver to EU citizens a credible promise that Europe is the solution in terms of jobs, welfare, security, and inclusion, rather than being part of the problem. More integration is needed both at the Euro area and the European Union levels. It is a complex task which requires many components. I am convinced that several of such components, Germany and Italy share a common view. Thank you for your attention. I guess I have to stay here, right?
Thank you, Minister Padoan, for this wonderful speech. I think one could sense the background of your academic career as a researcher and your political responsibility, which is combining now to a tremendous challenge for a person, not just in Italy, anywhere in Europe dealing with the problems. I think the key messages was we have to overcome uncertainty, we have to exploit the potential which is included in this European project, but to break it down to national responsibilities, how to implement what is needed. You are daily confronted with the problems of implementing what we as economists think is needed to overcome uncertainty, to create trust of our people in the European project and in national policies, and maintain, increase the credibility of our institutions on the national level as well as on the European level. Having listened to Jens Weidmann's speech, probably it happened to you too. I was thinking myself, I've been in Italy so often, and I was thinking, did it have any impact on my economic thinking? Probably I was immune against that. I don't know. So perhaps you should stay somewhat longer here. We would invite you and work on you with better weather, hopefully. But I will not continue to waste time because Minister Padoan is ready to take a few questions from the audience. Please raise your hands and keep your intervention as short as possible so we have time for many interventions. The first one is here.
Claire Jones, Financial Times. Mr. Padoan, you mentioned referenda several times in your speech. Would it be possible for you to spell out what you think the economic impact of a no vote in December would be on the Italian and indeed the Eurozone economy?
Yeah.
I was betting some money on the fact that at least the first few questions would be on my country. But as Ottmar kindly reminded me, maybe I should absorb more German economic culture to provide an answer. I can tell you what will happen with a yes vote, which I think will prevail. This will further boost the reform effort for two reasons, two broad reasons. One, because the reform itself is a great boost to institutional simplification, elimination of conflicts, administrative conflicts between, for instance, the regions and the central government, simplification of the legislation process, and so forth. So this will accelerate any reform which will be introduced in the country after the new constitutional framework. But the second point is about confidence. It's about, to quote myself, if I may, it's about reducing policy uncertainty. We are now feeling in the country, but not just in the country, in many countries in Europe, what policy uncertainty means. It means that there is a freezing wait-and-see attitude and atmosphere for the doomsday. This atmosphere is detrimental, however you take a look at it, for economic activity, because you simply abstain from taking decisions, either investments or consumptions or you name it, which are badly needed and would produce welfare. So I am concerned about this wait-and-see attitude. Of course, it will end up soon. Since your newspaper deals with financial markets on a daily, on hourly base, I would say, minute base, you certainly know better than I do that in financial markets there is this idea that the referendum is the end of the world. Well, it is not. If the unfortunate case is that the no vote prevails, the country will continue to reform, because the country, as reformed, and Jens Weidmann was kind enough to remind a few of the reforms we have implemented, even with the old institutional framework. So this will not by itself decrease the impetus of the government. It will produce a boost in confidence in the country, and hopefully also in financial markets will stop looking with anxiety at this situation. And if I may add that, neglecting the many very important improvements that the country has achieved over the recent past.
Thank you. Next question. Here.
You suggested...
And the next is here.
You suggested a scheme against cyclical unemployment to mitigate negative fiscal shocks, and you suggested that it would have no winners and losers in the long run. How would you make that sure?
Not myself, I would have liked to do so, but I don't have time to do it. We have run several simulations in different cases, and over the long term, such a scheme has to be approached and appreciated over the medium to long term, which means several years. Given the past performance of the labor markets in euro area countries and given some reasonable projections of labor markets in the future, all countries, let me say, including Germany, would benefit at some stage. So in the end, this is a no-change solution. There is no transfer solution. So we've done it through the usual tools that economists use when they try to design policy instruments. It's not an act of fate.
I think in the context of the Brexit vote, one could see that those who felt left behind have developed also anti-European, anti-globalization attitudes. And as economists on the Pareto optimum, we were convinced that free trade, etc., competition would increase welfare on the general level, and the winners could compensate the losers. But this is easily described and very difficult to implement.
I think the policymakers have a new challenge, and I'm saying this because this is what in the global policy fora I attend, the G20, the G7, the two new words on the ground. It's not just growth and jobs, it's policy certainty or political certainty and inclusion. If you go back to the recent meetings, including the IMF meetings, the annual meetings a few weeks ago, this was the main theme, and to me and to many of my colleagues, this proved as to be as a surprise, but after all, almost a natural outcome of the fact that we are in a different world, and we have to take that into account in our policy recommendations. To come to your point, Ottmar, now that we have realized that the inequality and inclusion issue as well, the policy uncertainty issues, are relevant for economic performance, we must introduce or think about policy design and design of policy instruments that take those dimensions into account. And also this is based on what I believe to be strong evidence that in a less unequal world, not only we are better off from a welfare point of view, but we are also more efficient. And so we have to ask how we can translate it into policy recommendations. We cannot simply ignore that dimension anymore.
We will be more efficient if we are successful in implementing this compensation in a way which does not reduce incentives for those who are working.
Absolutely. Implementation of the right incentives are exactly the word that I like and I use most often in my new ECOFIN meetings. And I can tell you that from that point of view, my feelings with Wolfgang Schäuble, the Minister of Finance of this country, are very similar.
Next question, please. Yeah.
Maybe the gentleman there that was bypassed by mistake.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Minister Padoan, for the excellent, eloquent proposal for promoting growth and employment. I was surprised, however, that in this context you were addressing the need for solidarity in order to avoid uncertainty. We should be aware that solidarity is not a one-way road. It's a matter of give and take, but can be illustrated in many ways. Just to give you one example, please. In our country, Germany, we're having an energy turnaround presently carried out, while with this policy, our country is pioneering the transition to clean sources of energy in Europe and beyond. The households and business companies have to shoulder the very high burden of this policy that is tying up their financial resources to a large extent. Acting in solidarity is, of course, essential for the good functioning of the European Union. It should, however, not become misused to disregard hard economic facts. And I think you would agree to this conclusion.
I would certainly agree, so I have nothing to add. But let me add one element, if I may. If I understood correctly the example you offered, this is about energy and evidently about environment-related issues. This, to me, brings the very obvious idea that solidarity is both intragenerational and intergenerational. So you have to take also the solidarity with future generations into account, preserving public goods that we cherish and we think are fundamental for our children and grandchildren.
Carlo, do you have time for one more question?
Oh, yes.
It's fine. Here. We take two questions together?
Take two questions together.
Here and here.
If they're the same question, that was simply...
Okay.
I cannot guarantee.
We didn't, no solidarity. Minister, how do you see the role of the central banks? Our understanding so far always has been that their neutrality in relation to politics is essential for market-oriented society. Is it correct that in the past you see the approach and the policy of central banks being abused by politics? In other words, measures which normally should be taken by policy for reforms, etc., that they are taking the central banks, the role of the central banks, to try to find solutions for where they normally should not, which gives a different view between parts of Europe and other parts of Europe regarding the role of monetary policy and the role of central banks in relation to politics.
Well, thank you. This is a complicated and challenging question, and I hesitate to answer in the presence of Jens Weidmann, but I cannot resist the temptation to answer anyways. Let me start by saying a few words about my career as a researcher. I was very much keen in looking at, in the 1990s, at the process of building up monetary union. And of course, one of the key elements of the debate, sometimes fierce debate, what kind of model should the European Central Bank follow? And of course, we all know that there was no doubt, including in my own mind, that the model should be the one based on the Bundesbank's model, in broad terms. And I think this was the right choice. Of course, the ECB is a different institution than from national central banks. But at my time, in those times, also your time, central banks had, especially several years ago, different attitudes, different relationships with the treasuries, and the issue of independence was taken from different perspectives. In the end, I think we have converged to a stable and very predictable model of the central bank. However, we must, of course, recognize that since the inception of the financial crisis, central banks have come to respond to totally new challenges. And we are now, we all know now that we are threatened with negative interest rates, very low inflation, if not outright disinflation or deflation risks. So the central banks are called, in the years of the euro area construction, they were called to preserve monetary stability with keeping inflation low. Now we are challenging, they are challenging, but we also are challenging with the fact that we have to keep monetary stability, but we need more inflation. So we are in a different world. All of this could have not been possible if the central banks were not independent. Let me say, and I think this from the bottom of my heart, that we have to be very grateful, not just in Europe, but around the world, to central banks that were the first response to the big financial crisis, which, let's face it, no one was expecting to be so deep, so strong, and so devastating. So central banks charged the response to the enemy of the financial crisis by accepting to change themselves to deal with the new challenges. Of course, now the challenge is to go back to more normal situation, number one. Second thoughts about central banks. I very much share the view that monetary policy is very important and should continue to provide a contribution to getting to higher growth. But of course, monetary policy by itself will not do the jobs. And it is the responsibility of governments to adopt the appropriate fiscal policy stance and to adopt the appropriate structural reforms so that monetary policy can be more effective. If we do the structural reforms, we help ourselves, but we also help the central banks to do their jobs. So this is a new world, which, however, rests on the roots of the construction of, in the case of Europe, of the Euro Monetary Union, on how the ECB was generated and how it was guided. So thank you to the central banks.
May I just continue along these lines? The ECB recently has published in its economic bulletin the result of research which showed how important the institution structural reforms are to create growth, employment, jobs, etc.
I must read that paper.
Yeah, it's demonstrating there is a high potential in a number of countries, which in combination with very expansionary monetary policy should bring really much higher growth in effect as we see today. So if, to cut it short, you think this buying time, as it is called by the ECB, was used enough to conduct the needed structural reforms?
I can speak for my own country. I think that certainly the speed of structural reforms in my country has been hugely accelerated. And I would like to speak on behalf of my government for a second, because this has been a major achievement. Let me give you one example, which is not very much in the policy discussions, but I think it's very important. We have introduced a number of very important banking sector reforms, which are structural, including a reform of the popularity banks, which have been forced above a given dimension to transform themselves into joint stock companies, and therefore foster, although of course not impose, a M&A, a merger process, which has now very recently produced its first very important results. Two former popularity banks have merged in Milan to generate the third largest Italian bank. And this has immediately generated an upgrade in a rating from rating agencies. So this is just one example of the fact that reforms have been implemented. Why am I saying this? Because that same reform has been sitting on a shelf of Italian policymakers for 20 years. This was not a new idea, it was an old idea, but no one implemented it. So the need for implementation is essential. Again, implementation, implementation, implementation. I'm quoting a good friend of mine.
Here.
Thank you, Minister and Professor Issing. I will keep it short. Do you think that Italy will be able to fight the corruption in its system to make federal reforms possible and more effective?
The long answer is yes, we're already doing it.
Thank you.
We have to complete the question for those of you who are not informed. We have introduced an anti-corruption agency which is getting stronger and stronger, whose aim is exactly to check whatever goes by the public sector in terms of contracts, hiring people and so forth. They have to be validated by the anti-corruption. This is just one step. I'm not saying that we've closed, but we are very committed in implementing an anti-corruption strategy, which I agree is a very important problem for Italy, and if I may say so, for other countries as well.
So one last question here. Take the mic.
Thank you very much for your speech, Minister. You mentioned in your speech inclusion. Inclusion is an element for leadership. And my question is, What are your ideas for the political leaders in the future? What special skills, maybe 3 or 4 special skills, the leaders of the future need to bring the results you spoke in your speech?
You are right in implicitly pointing out that I did not develop the concept of inclusion and I did not suggest explicitly policy measures. I can, given the time is short, I can just remind ourselves that the 2 master ways to enhance inclusion are to create jobs and skills. A country which does not provide job opportunities also is very in a big difficulty in providing inclusiveness. Inclusiveness both in terms of income, in terms of well-being, in terms of decent life, but also in terms of expectations. So basically, policies that promote jobs and attract into the labor market the weakest segments are the right policies. Policies that develop the right skills, which is a very, very difficult task. The right skills for the future when they will have to find a job in the labor market. Those are very difficult tasks. So what should political leaders do? They should understand that when they establish their priority list, they should put these items at the top. This is very easily said. It's more difficult to do it because lots of resistance arises immediately whenever a policy project is put on the table.
Thank you so much, Carlo. I think some questions are left which we will discuss bilaterally later.
Yes.
So I'm looking forward to that, and I would like to thank Minister Padoan for his impressive presentation of the challenges we are faced with. I think we have first to agree on the appropriate analysis and then to come to the right conclusion, and then it's what you said, implementation, 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 and for that we wish you good luck for the sake of your country and of Europe. Thank you so much for coming here.